The woman sprawled across the marble steps was soaked through, her wedding dress clinging to her like a shroud, and when Eryndor Xanthos descended to see what his night guard was muttering about, he found himself staring at the kind of ruin that made even an immortal pause. She was shaking so violently her teeth chattered, her lips nearly blue in the gray pre-dawn light. The dress had been expensive once, he could tell that much, layers of ivory silk and lace now torn at the hem and smeared with mud. One sleeve hung half off her shoulder. Her dark hair had come loose from whatever elaborate style it had been pinned into, and it clung to her face in wet strands. His guards stood at a respectful distance waiting for orders. They expected him to delegate, to have someone from the household staff deal with this bedraggled mortal who had somehow made it past the outer gates. That was protocol. That was sense. Eryndor knelt instead, his white hair falling forward as he leaned down to look at her face. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and rapid. When he touched her wrist to check her pulse, her skin was ice. "My lord," one of the guards began, uncertain. Eryndor did not answer. He slid one arm beneath her knees and the other around her shoulders, lifting her against his chest in a single smooth motion. She weighed almost nothing, or perhaps it only felt that way because he had not held anyone like this in longer than he cared to remember. The wet silk of her dress soaked into his shirt immediately, cold and clinging. Her head lolled against his shoulder as he stood, and he adjusted his grip, cradling her more securely. She smelled like rain and fear and something floral, some perfume that was probably expensive and entirely wrong for her. He could hear her heartbeat, fast and thready, fighting to keep her alive. "Send for Ilyana," he said quietly. "Have her prepare the East guest suite, warm water, blankets, and whatever else she thinks necessary, and send someone to find out where this woman came from." The guards bowed and scattered. Eryndor turned and carried his unexpected guest through the tall doors into the entrance hall, his footsteps silent on the polished stone floor. The manor was still quiet at this hour, most of the household either asleep or conducting business in the lower levels. Dawn was breaking outside, which meant he would need to retreat to the interior rooms soon, away from the windows. But first, he would see her settled somewhere safe. He climbed the main staircase with her in his arms, moving through the halls of the east wing until he reached the suite he had indicated. It was one of the finest guest rooms, decorated in shades of deep blue and silver, with a four-poster bed and a fireplace already laid with wood. He set her down gently on the bed, then stepped back, studying her in the better light. She was younger than he had first thought, probably no more than 23 or 24. Her face was pale and drawn, shadows beneath her eyes. There were scratches on her arms and legs as though she had run through brambles. Her feet, he realized, were bare and bleeding. Ilyana appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. She was one of his oldest retainers, a turned vampire who had served his household for over a century, and very little surprised her anymore. But even she raised an eyebrow at the sight of the soaked woman on the bed. "A runaway bride, it appears," Eryndor said, stepping aside so Ilyana could approach. "See to her injuries and get her warm. When she wakes, feed her and let her rest. I want to know the moment she is coherent enough to speak." "Of course, my lord." Ilyana moved forward with brisk efficiency, already assessing what needed to be done. "Shall I send for a human physician?" Eryndor hesitated, then shook his head. "Not yet. Let us see what she says when she wakes. She may not wish for anyone outside this house to know she is here." "As you say." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway, looking back. The woman had begun to stir slightly, her brow furrowing, her hands moving restlessly against the coverlet. Ilyana was already pulling blankets up around her, murmuring something soothing. Eryndor left before he could second-guess the impulse that had made him carry her inside himself instead of leaving her to the staff. It had been a strange thing to do, an overly personal gesture that his court would certainly notice and remark upon if word spread. He had not done such a thing in living memory. He had not wanted to. But when he had seen her there on his steps, shivering and broken in that torn wedding dress, something in his chest had twisted hard enough to hurt. He retreated to his study, a windowless room deep in the manor, and sat down at his desk. The reports and correspondence he needed to review were piled neatly to one side, but he ignored them. Instead, he stared at the far wall, thinking about the woman upstairs. A runaway bride. Fleeing to his door specifically, or simply fleeing, and his manor had been the first shelter she found. The Xanthos estate was well known in the region, both to mortals and to the vampire community. It sat on a hilltop overlooking the city, surrounded by old-growth forest, close enough to civilization to make trade and governance feasible, but remote enough to afford privacy. Mortals knew it as the home of a reclusive but powerful family. Vampires knew it as the seat of the king who ruled the northern territories. If she had come here deliberately, she must be desperate. Mortals did not usually seek out vampires unless they had run out of every other option. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter." One of the younger guards stepped inside, bowing. "My lord, we found tracks leading from the main road up through the forest to the gates. She came on foot, likely through the night. There is no sign of pursuit yet, but someone may come looking once the sun is fully up." "Post additional guards at the perimeter," Eryndor said. "No one is to enter the grounds without my permission, and no information about our guest is to leave this house. Understood?" "Yes, my lord." When the guard had gone, Eryndor leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. The sun would be fully risen now, which meant he would be confined indoors until nightfall. Not that it mattered. He had centuries of practice at filling the daylight hours with work, with correspondence, with the endless small tasks of governing a territory that spanned 3 cities and countless smaller settlements. But today he found his mind wandering back to the woman upstairs, wondering what had driven her to run, wondering who she was fleeing from, wondering why the sight of her on his steps had affected him so deeply. It was nearly noon when Ilyana came to find him. He had managed to work through most of the correspondence by then, though his focus was still scattered. Ilyana knocked once and entered at his gesture, her face calm but her eyes holding a hint of concern. "She is awake, my lord, weak but lucid. She has asked where she is and who brought her in. I told her you carried her inside yourself. She seemed surprised." "I imagined she was." Eryndor set down the letter he had been reading. "Is she well enough to speak with me?" "I believe so. She has eaten a little and had some water. Her injuries are minor, mostly scrapes and bruises. Exhaustion and cold were the greater dangers, but those have been addressed." "Good. I will go to her now." He rose and followed Ilyana back through the halls to the east wing. The door to the guest suite was open, and he paused at the threshold, looking in. The woman was sitting up in bed, wrapped in blankets, her hair still damp but combed out now, so that it fell in dark waves around her shoulders. She wore a clean nightgown that Ilyana must have provided, and there was a tray of half-eaten food on the table beside the bed. Her face was still pale, but her eyes were alert, watching the doorway. Those eyes widened slightly when she saw him. He understood why. He was tall and white-haired, his skin the pale marble of the very old vampires, his features sharp and aristocratic. He had dressed simply this morning, but there was no hiding what he was. The red gaze, the unnatural stillness, the faint aura of old power that clung to him like cologne. "My lord," she said, her voice hoarse, "I am told I owe you my life." "You owe me a roof and a warm bed," he said, stepping into the room. Ilyana withdrew discreetly, closing the door behind her. "Your life is your own. May I sit?" She nodded quickly, and he drew a chair over to the bedside, settling into it with the easy grace of a predator at rest. Up close, he could see that her eyes were hazel, more gold than green, and that her hands were shaking slightly where they gripped the blankets. "What is your name?" he asked gently. "Gwendolyn," she said. "Gwendolyn Irwood." "Gwendolyn." He let the name rest on his tongue, tasting it. "I am Eryndor Xanthos. You are in my home. You collapsed on my steps at dawn wearing a wedding gown. I would very much like to know why." She flinched slightly, and he saw her eyes drop to the blankets. For a moment he thought she might refuse to answer, but then she took a shaky breath and met his gaze again. "I ran," she said simply. "From the wedding, from him, from all of it." "From whom?" "His name is Marcus Devereaux. He is immortal, but his family has connections to the vampire courts. They deal in information and favors, and they are very good at collecting debts." Eryndor felt something cold settle in his chest. He knew the name Devereaux. Everyone in the vampire community knew that name. They were brokers, middlemen who operated in the gray spaces between mortal and immortal law. Useful when you needed something done quietly, dangerous when you crossed them. "What debt did you owe them?" he asked. Gwendolyn's hands tightened on the blankets. "Not mine. My father's. He borrowed money from them years ago to keep his business afloat. He thought he could pay it back, but the terms were predatory and the interest kept growing. When he died 6 months ago, the debt passed to me. I had no way to pay it, no money, no assets that they had not already seized, so they offered me a different kind of payment. Marriage, Eryndor said quietly. Yes. Her voice was bitter now, edged with anger. Marry Marcus Devereaux and the debt would be forgiven. They said it was generous. They said I should be grateful. They said it was the only way. And you did not agree. I agreed because I had no choice, she said, and now her voice shook. They made it very clear what would happen if I refused. Debtor's prison at best, or worse. They have ways of making people disappear. So I said yes. I went through with the preparations. I stood in that church yesterday and put on that dress and walked down the aisle because I did not know what else to do. But you ran, Eryndor said. He kept his voice even, but something in him had gone very still, very cold. This was not a story he had expected to hear. This was not a simple case of cold feet or a bad match. I ran, Gwendolyn agreed, at the last moment. The officiant asked if I took him as my husband, and I opened my mouth to say yes, and instead I just ran. I ran out of the church and down the road and into the forest. I did not know where I was going. I just knew I could not do it. I could not marry him. I could not spend my life paying for my father's mistakes. Her eyes were shining now with unshed tears, and Eryndor found himself leaning forward slightly, his hands resting on his knees. How did you come to be here? He asked. I remembered hearing about this place, she said, about the vampire lord who lives on the hill. People say you are fair, that you honor the old codes, but also have a sense of justice. I thought if I could reach you, if I could ask for sanctuary, you might listen. I know it was foolish. I know I have no right to ask anything of you. But I had nowhere else to go. Eryndor sat back, processing this. She had come to him deliberately then, thrown herself on his mercy because she believed he would help her. The thought stirred something complicated in his chest, something that felt almost like pride mixed with an aching tenderness he had not felt in decades. You are safe here, he said at last, for now at least. The Devereaux family will come looking for you, and when they do, we will need to address the situation, but you will not be forced to leave, and you will not be forced to marry anyone you do not choose. Her breath hitched, and a tear slipped down her cheek. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you. Rest, he said, standing. You have been through an ordeal. We will talk more tonight, once I have had time to make some inquiries. In the meantime, you are my guest. Ilyana will see to anything you need. He left her there, closing the door gently behind him. In the hallway, he stood for a moment with his hand on the doorframe, his mind racing. The Devereaux family. Debt bondage, sanctioned under one of the old codes that the vampire courts had endorsed centuries ago, when mortal and immortal law were more intertwined. It was a barbaric practice, one that Eryndor had always disliked but never moved to abolish, because it was so rarely invoked. The Devereaux family was one of the few mortal bloodlines with enough standing in the vampire community to claim that kind of authority, and now they had tried to use it to force a young woman into marriage. Eryndor moved through the halls back to his study, his steps quick and silent. He needed information. He needed to know exactly what debt Gwendolyn's father had incurred, what terms had been set, and what legal standing the Devereaux family claimed in trying to collect it through marriage. He sat down at his desk and began writing letters. One to his chief legal advisor, a vampire named Lucian, who specialized in old law and could recite code going back 1,000 years. Another to his network of informants in the city, asking for everything they could find on Marcus Devereaux and his family's recent dealings. A third to the ruling council of the vampire courts, informing them that he was investigating a potential misuse of the debt bondage code and requesting their patience while he gathered facts. By the time he finished, the sun was beginning to set. He sent the letters off with his fastest couriers, then allowed himself a moment to simply sit and think. The truth was that he had no legal grounds to refuse the Devereaux family if they could prove the debt was legitimate and the terms clear. The code was ancient, written into the fabric of agreements between mortals and vampires long before his reign. If he wanted to protect Gwendolyn, he would need to find a flaw in their claim or a loophole in the law, or he would need to change the law itself. That thought gave him pause. Overturning a code that old, one that was still nominally in use, would require convening the full court, and making a formal argument before the assembled lords and ladies. It would be a spectacle, a political risk. Some of the older vampires clung to tradition with a ferocity that made progress nearly impossible. But as he thought of Gwendolyn upstairs, pale and exhausted and frightened, wearing a torn wedding gown because she had been sold to pay a debt she did not owe, Eryndor felt his resolve harden. If it came to that, he would do it. He would overturn the code and free not just her but anyone else trapped in similar circumstances. But first, he needed to see what information his people could gather. Nightfall came fully, and with it the freedom to move through the manor without concern for windows or sunlight. Eryndor left his study and went to find Ileana, who reported that Gwendolyn had slept for most of the afternoon and was now awake again, asking tentatively if she might have something more to eat. "Feed her whatever she likes," Eryndor said, "and have someone bring her proper clothing. She will need more than a nightgown if she is to stay here for any length of time." "Already done, my lord. I took the liberty of having a few things brought up from storage. They may need altering, but they will serve for now." "Good." He hesitated, then added, "How does she seem to you?" Ileana considered the question. "Shaken, but not broken. She has a will in her, that one. I think she would have fought if she could, but she had no weapons and no allies. Now she has both, if you choose to give them to her." "I do," Eryndor said quietly. "Make sure she knows she is under my protection." "She already knows, my lord. The way you carried her inside made that clear enough." He did not respond to that, but he felt the faint prickle of self-consciousness that came with being observed by someone who had known him for over a century. Ileana had a way of seeing through his masks, of understanding what he would not say aloud. He returned to the guest suite after dinner, knocking lightly before entering at Gwendolyn's invitation. She was sitting by the fire now, dressed in a simple gown of deep green that suited her far better than the ruined wedding dress had. Her hair was dry and loose around her shoulders, and there was a bit more color in her cheeks. "You look better," he said, taking the chair across from her. "I feel better," she admitted. "I still cannot quite believe I am here, that you took me in. I thought you might turn me away. I would not have blamed you if you had." "Turning away someone in need is not something I do lightly," Eryndor said, "especially not when that person has been wronged by a system that my own kind helped create." She looked at him curiously. "You mean the debt bondage code?" "Yes. It is an old law, one that I have never liked but also never moved to change. I am beginning to think that was a mistake." "It is not your fault," Gwendolyn said quickly. "You did not create the debt. You did not force my father to borrow money he could not repay. You are not responsible for any of this." "Perhaps not," Eryndor said, "but I am responsible for the laws that govern this territory, and if those laws allow for injustices like what you have suffered, then it is my duty to address them." She was quiet for a moment, her hands folded in her lap. Then she said, "What will happen when they come for me?" "They will come," Eryndor said, because there was no point in lying to her. "The Devereux family is too powerful and too proud to let this go without a fight. When they arrive, they will demand your return. They will cite the debt bondage code and claim legal authority, and I will need to decide how to respond. What are your options?" He appreciated that she asked, that she wanted to understand the situation, rather than simply hoping he would fix everything. It spoke to a pragmatism and intelligence that he found deeply appealing. "I can attempt to negotiate," he said. "Perhaps offer to pay the debt myself in exchange for your freedom. That would satisfy the letter of the law, and it would free you from the obligation to marry Marcus Devereux. But it would also set a precedent, and it would validate the code itself. I would be saying that debt bondage is acceptable as long as someone pays." "And you do not want to say that," Gwendolyn said slowly. "No," Eryndor said, "I do not. The alternative is to challenge the code itself, to argue before the vampire court that it is outdated and unjust, that it should be abolished entirely. That would take time, and it would be politically difficult. But it would free not just you, but anyone else trapped in similar circumstances." "How many others are there?" "I do not know," Eryndor admitted. "The code is rarely invoked, and when it is usually handled quietly. But if the Devereux family is using it, there may be others as well. Families who see it as a convenient way to collect debts or consolidate power." Gwendolyn was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Then she said, I do not want you to risk yourself for me. If paying the debt is simpler, if it will keep you out of political trouble, then do that. I will find some way to repay you, even if it takes the rest of my life." "I do not want your repayment," Eryndor said, more sharply than he intended. She looked at him, startled, and he forced himself to soften his tone. "Forgive me. I only mean that you do not owe me anything, and I will not take the easier path simply because it is easier. If the code is unjust, then it should be abolished. You are not the only person who deserves better." She studied him for a long moment, and he found himself unable to look away from those hazel eyes. There was something in her gaze that made him feel seen in a way he had not been seen in years, as though she were peeling back the layers of formality and reserve to glimpse the man beneath the king. "You are not what I expected," she said at last. "What did you expect?" "I do not know. Someone colder, perhaps, more distant. People speak of you with awe, but also with fear. They say you are powerful and dangerous and not to be crossed." "I am all of those things," Eryndor said quietly, "but I am also capable of compassion. The two are not mutually exclusive." She smiled faintly, and he felt something in his chest shift, like the first crack in ice before the spring thaw. They talked for a while longer, about small things and large ones. She told him about her father, a man who had worked hard all his life and made one bad decision that had cost him everything. She told him about her childhood, growing up in a modest house in the city, and about the slow unraveling of her life after her father's death. He found himself telling her things in return, bits and pieces of his own history that he rarely shared with anyone. The weight of ruling, the loneliness of immortality, the way the years blurred together after the first few centuries. It was easier to talk to her than it should have been, and that realization both comforted and unsettled him. When the clock chimed midnight, he stood reluctantly. "You should rest. Tomorrow may bring complications, and you will need your strength." "Will you come see me again?" she asked, and there was something tentative in her voice, almost shy. "If you wish it," Eryndor said. "I do." He left her there and returned to his own quarters, but sleep did not come easily. He lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the way her voice had sounded when she thanked him, the way her eyes had shone with unshed tears. Thinking about the curve of her mouth when she smiled, the way she listened with her full attention, as though everything he said mattered. He had not felt this way in a very long time, had not allowed himself to feel this way, because it was dangerous and complicated and inevitably ended in pain. Mortals lived such brief lives, burning bright and fast before flickering out. Loving one was an exercise in heartbreak. But as he lay there in the dark, Eryndor could not deny the truth. He was already halfway in love with the runaway bride who had shivered on his steps at dawn. The Devereux family arrived 2 nights later, exactly as Eryndor had predicted. He was in his study when the guards informed him that a party of 3 had come to the gates demanding entry. Marcus Devereux himself, along with his father Hadrian, and a lawyer whose name Eryndor did not catch. "Show them to the receiving hall," he said calmly, "and inform Lady Gwendolen that our guests have arrived. Ask if she would like to be present for the discussion." The guard bowed and left. Eryndor took a moment to collect himself, then rose and made his way to the receiving hall. It was a formal room, high-ceilinged and elegant, with tall windows that were shuttered now against the night. He took his seat at the head of the room in the carved chair that served as a throne when the occasion demanded it, and waited. The Devereux family entered a few minutes later, escorted by 2 of Eryndor's guards. Marcus was a man in his early 30s, handsome in a bland sort of way, with slicked-back dark hair and an expensive suit. His father Hadrian was older, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, carrying himself with the confidence of a man who had spent decades navigating dangerous waters. The lawyer was a thin, nervous-looking mortal clutching a briefcase. They stopped a respectful distance from Eryndor's chair and bowed, though the gesture was perfunctory at best. "Lord Xanthos," Hadrian said smoothly, "we appreciate you seeing us on such short notice." "You demanded entry to my home in the middle of the night," Eryndor said mildly. "I am choosing to interpret that as urgency rather than rudeness. What can I do for you?" "We are looking for someone," Marcus said, and his voice was tight with barely suppressed anger. "A young woman named Gwendolen Irwood. We have reason to believe she is here." Do you? Eryndor said. It was not a question. She ran from our wedding 2 nights ago, Marcus continued. She is legally bound to me through a debt agreement, and I am here to collect what is mine. What is yours? Eryndor repeated, his tone cooling. You speak of a woman as though she is property. Under the debt bondage code, she is, Hadrian interjected smoothly. Her father borrowed a substantial sum from our family with clear terms. Upon his death, the debt passed to his heir. We offered marriage as a settlement, which is both legal and generous. She agreed to the terms. Her flight from the ceremony is a breach of contract. And you believe that gives you the right to take her by force? Eryndor asked. We believe that gives us the right to enforce the agreement, Hadrian said. We are not unreasonable men, Lord Xanthos. We understand that the girl may have been overwhelmed, that perhaps she panicked. We are willing to overlook her breach if she returns with us tonight, and the marriage is completed within the week. How magnanimous, Eryndor said dryly. The door to the receiving hall opened again, and Gwendolen entered, flanked by Ileana. She was dressed in one of the gowns Ileana had found for her, a deep burgundy that made her skin glow, and her hair was pinned up in a simple but elegant style. She looked poised and calm, though Eryndor could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. Marcus's expression shifted immediately when he saw her, something predatory flashing across his face. There you are, he said, taking a step forward. We have been looking everywhere for you. I did not wish to be found, Gwendolen said evenly. She did not move toward him, staying instead beside Ileana at a safe distance. What you wish is irrelevant, Marcus snapped. You made an agreement. You stood in that church and participated in the ceremony. You owe me a marriage, and I intend to collect. She owes you nothing, Eryndor said, and the room went very cold very fast. He did not raise his voice, but there was steel in it now, an edge that made even Hadrian take a step back. Lady Gwendolen is under my protection. She will not be leaving with you tonight or any other night unless she chooses to do so of her own free will. You have no authority to interfere in a lawful debt agreement, the lawyer said, his voice shaking slightly. The debt bondage code is recognized by the vampire courts. If you obstruct us, we will bring a formal complaint before the council. Do so, Eryndor said calmly. I welcome the opportunity to discuss the debt bondage code with the council. In fact, I intend to call for a formal review of the code and a vote on whether it should remain in force. Hadrian's eyes narrowed. You would overturn a law that has stood for centuries? If that law is unjust, yes, Eryndor said. The debt bondage code was written in a different time, under different circumstances. It has no place in the modern world, and I will argue as much before the council. You are making a mistake, Hadrian said, his voice low and dangerous. Our family has considerable influence, Lord Xanthos. You are not the only power in the vampire courts. If you move against us, there will be consequences. Then let there be consequences, Eryndor said. I am not afraid of you, Hadrian, and I will not allow you to abuse a law that was meant to ensure fair debts, not to enslave young women. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Marcus looked like he wanted to lunge forward, but his father placed a hand on his arm, holding him back. We will see you before the council, then, Hadrian said coldly. And when we do, we will expect the full weight of the law to be brought to bear. You cannot simply ignore precedent because you have taken a liking to the girl. I am not ignoring precedent, Eryndor said. I am challenging it. There is a difference. The Devereux family left shortly after, their anger palpable. Eryndor waited until the guards had escorted them out of the manor and back to the gates before he rose from his chair and crossed the room to where Gwendolen stood. Are you all right? He asked quietly. She nodded, though her hands were trembling slightly. I did not think it would be so confrontational. I thought perhaps you could negotiate, that they might be reasonable. Men like Hadrian Devereux are never reasonable when they think they have the law on their side, Eryndor said. But you were very brave, standing there and facing them. That took courage. I was terrified, she admitted. Courage is not the absence of fear, Eryndor said. It is acting despite it. You did well. She looked up at him and something passed between them, something warm and bright and fragile. He wanted to reach out, to touch her hand or her cheek, to offer some physical comfort to match the words. But he held himself back, aware of the impropriety, aware that she was vulnerable and he was in a position of power. What happens now? She asked. Now we prepare, Eryndor said. I will convene the council and make my case. It will take time to gather the lords and ladies, perhaps a few weeks. In the meantime, you will stay here, safe and under my protection. No one will touch you. And if the council does not agree? If they uphold the debt bondage code? Then I will find another way, Eryndor said. I will not let them take you, Gwendolen. I swear it. She believed him. He could see it in her eyes, the trust and the hope, and he felt the weight of that trust settle over him like a mantle, both humbling and terrifying. The weeks that followed were some of the strangest and most intense of Eryndor's long life. He spent his days drafting arguments and consulting with legal advisors, building the case for why the debt bondage code should be abolished. He corresponded with allies on the council, gauging support, and prepared for the inevitable opposition from traditionalists who would see his proposal as an attack on the old ways. But he also spent his evenings with Gwendolen. It started innocently enough. She was his guest, after all, and it would have been rude not to check on her welfare. But what began as brief visits to ensure she had everything she needed gradually lengthened into long conversations by the fire, hours spent talking about everything and nothing. She was intelligent and curious, asking him about vampire culture and history, about the politics of the courts, about his own life and experiences. He found himself telling her stories he had not shared in decades, about the early years of his reign, about the wars and alliances that had shaped the territory, about the loneliness of living for centuries while everyone around him aged and died. She listened with a focus that was both flattering and unnerving, and she offered insights that surprised him. She was not educated in the formal sense, but she had a sharp mind and a keen understanding of human nature that came from experience rather than books. "You carry a great deal of weight," she said one night, after he had finished describing a particularly difficult negotiation with a rival lord. "Does it ever feel too heavy?" "Sometimes," he admitted, "but it is my duty. I chose this when I accepted the crown, and I do not regret it." "Do you ever wish you could set it down? Just for a little while?" "All the time," Eryndor said, and the honesty of the answer surprised even him. "But there is no one else to carry it, and so I continue." She reached out then, her hand covering his where it rested on the arm of his chair. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt through him, warm and electric. "You do not have to carry it alone," she said softly. "Not anymore. Not while I am here." He looked at her, and the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, the fire crackling in the hearth and the soft glow of candlelight painting her face in gold and shadow. He wanted to tell her that she did not understand, that she was mortal and he was not, that any connection between them was doomed from the start, but he could not make himself say the words, because the truth was that he did not want to carry it alone anymore. He wanted her beside him, bright and warm and alive, a counterpoint to the cold eternity of his existence. "Gwendolen," he said, and his voice was rougher than he intended. "You should be careful. I am not a safe man to care for." "I know what you are," she said, "and I'm not afraid." "You should be." "Why? Because you are a vampire? Because you have lived for centuries, and I will be gone in a blink of your eye?" She shook her head. "I'm not afraid of that. I'm more afraid of wasting the time I have, of never taking the chance to feel something real." "This is real," Eryndor said quietly. "More real than I expected, and that terrifies me." She smiled, and it was the saddest, most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Then we will be terrified together." He did not kiss her that night, though he wanted to. Instead, he simply held her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, and they sat in silence until the fire burned low. But the next night, and the night after that, he found himself drawn back to her side. They walked through the gardens together, the moonlight turning everything silver and strange. They sat in the library and read to each other, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of poetry, while he listened and watched the way her mouth shaped the words. They talked about the future, about what might happen after the council meeting, about the life she might build if she were truly free. And slowly, carefully, Eryndor allowed himself to fall. It was not a sudden thing, not a lightning strike of passion. It was gradual, a slow thawing of the ice around his heart. He fell for her laughter, bright and unguarded. He fell for the way she challenged him, refusing to be intimidated even when he was at his most imposing. He fell for her kindness, the way she treated his servants with respect and gratitude, the way she noticed when someone was struggling and offered help without being asked. He fell for the way she looked at him, as though he were not a king or a monster, but simply a man worthy of her attention. And one night, 3 weeks after the Devereux family had come to his door, he finally let himself admit the truth. He was in love with her. They were in the garden again, standing beneath a pergola heavy with night-blooming jasmine. The air was sweet and cool, and the stars above were so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Gwendolen had been quiet for most of the walk, and Eryndor could sense that something was weighing on her mind. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "I'm thinking about what comes next, after the council meeting. If you succeed in abolishing the code, I will be free. I will be able to go wherever I wish, do whatever I want. I should be happy about that, and I am. But I'm also afraid." "Of what?" "Of leaving," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "I have been here for weeks now, and this place has started to feel like home. You have started to feel like home, and I do not know what to do with that." Eryndor's chest tightened. He turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to rest gently on her shoulders. "Then stay," he said. "Stay here, with me." "As what?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "As your guest, your ward, your charity case?" "As my equal," Eryndor said. "As the woman I love." Her breath caught, and he saw tears shining in her eyes. "You love me?" "I do," he said, and the admission was both freeing and terrifying. "I have tried not to. I have told myself 1,000 reasons why it is a terrible idea. But I cannot help it. I love you, Gwendolen. And if you will have me, I will spend whatever time we have together making sure you never regret taking shelter on my steps at dawn." She laughed, a choked sound that was half sob, and then she was reaching up, pulling him down so she could kiss him. It was not a careful kiss, not tentative or uncertain. It was fierce and desperate, and full of all the things they had not said, all the fear and hope and longing that had been building between them for weeks. Eryndor kissed her back, his arms coming around her to hold her close, and for the first time in centuries, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I will fight for you," he said quietly. "I will fight the council and the Devereux family and anyone else who tries to take you from me. But you need to know that being with me comes with complications. I am immortal, and you are not. That will mean hard choices eventually." "I know," she said, "and I do not care. I would rather have a short time with you than a long life without you." "There is another option," Eryndor said carefully, "if you wished it. If the time came and you were certain, I could turn you. You could become like me. We could have eternity together." She pulled back slightly, her eyes wide. "You would do that? For me?" "I would do anything for you," he said simply. "But it is not a decision to be made lightly. It is permanent, and it is not without cost. You would have to leave your mortal life behind, and you would have to live with the consequences of immortality. The hunger, the isolation, the weight of years. I would not ask it of you unless you were certain." "I am not certain yet," she admitted, "but I think I could be. In time. If this is real, if we truly have a future together, then I do not want to waste it watching myself grow old while you stay the same." "We have time," Eryndor said, kissing her forehead gently. "Let us deal with the council first. Let us make sure you are truly free. And then we can decide what comes next." She nodded, and they stood there together under the jasmine, holding each other as the night stretched on around them. The council convened 4 weeks after Gwendolen's arrival. It was held in the grand hall beneath the city, a vast underground chamber carved from stone and lit by thousands of candles. The ceiling soared overhead, lost in shadow, and the walls were lined with banners representing the various vampire houses and territories. Eryndor arrived early, dressed in formal robes of deep black and silver, his white hair bound back in a severe style that emphasized the sharpness of his features. He took his place at the head of the hall, in the seat reserved for the king, and waited as the other lords and ladies filed in. There were nearly 50 of them, representatives from all the major vampire families and territories in the northern region. Some were old allies, vampires who had supported Eryndor's reign from the beginning. Others were neutral, cautious politicians who would vote based on what served their own interests. And a few were openly hostile, traditionalists who resented any change to the old ways. The Devereaux family was there as well, seated near the back with their lawyer and a small entourage. Hadrian and Marcus both wore expressions of cold confidence, clearly certain that the council would uphold the debt bondage code. Gwendolen was not present. Eryndor had offered her the choice, but she had declined, saying that her presence would only make things more complicated. She was waiting in his private chambers, under guard, ready to hear the outcome as soon as the vote was called. The council came to order, and the senior arbiter, a vampire named Seraphine who had served the courts for over 6 centuries, stood to address the assembly. "We are gathered to hear a proposal from Lord Eryndor Xanthos, King of the Northern Territories," she said, her voice echoing through the hall. "The matter concerns the debt bondage code and whether it should remain in force. Lord Xanthos, you may begin." Eryndor rose, and the hall fell silent. He had spent weeks preparing this argument, refining it, anticipating every possible objection. Now, standing before the assembled court, he felt a strange calm settle over him. "My lords and ladies," he began, "I come before you today, not to attack tradition, but to question whether a tradition that was once useful has become a tool for abuse. The debt bondage code was created centuries ago to ensure that debts between mortals and vampires could be enforced fairly. It was meant to protect both parties, to create a legal framework that acknowledged the power imbalance between our kinds." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But over time, the code has been twisted. It has been used not to ensure fairness, but to trap vulnerable mortals in agreements they cannot escape. It has been used to force marriages, to claim human lives as property, to perpetuate a system that resembles slavery more than justice." Murmurs rippled through the hall, some approving, some disapproving. Eryndor continued, his voice steady. "4 weeks ago, a young woman named Gwendolen Irwood fled to my door on her wedding day. She had been forced into marriage to settle a debt her late father had incurred. She had no say in the matter, no ability to negotiate the terms, no recourse under the law. The Devereaux family claimed the debt bondage code gave them the right to demand her as payment, and under the current law, they were correct." He let that statement hang in the air. "But I ask you, is that justice? Is it right that a woman should be sold to pay a debt she did not incur? Is it right that mortals should live in fear of being trapped by agreements they cannot escape, simply because we have the power to enforce them?" Hadrian Devereaux rose from his seat, his expression thunderous. "You speak of fear and injustice, Lord Xanthos, but you ignore the very purpose of the code. Mortals enter into agreements with vampires of their own free will. Gwendolen Irwood's father borrowed money knowing the terms. He agreed to the consequences. His daughter inherited that debt, and she agreed to the marriage settlement. Where is the injustice in enforcing a contract that was willingly made?" "Willingly?" Eryndor's voice sharpened. "She agreed because you threatened her with prison or worse if she refused. That is not free will, Hadrian. That is coercion." "It is negotiation," Hadrian shot back. "We offered her a way out of an impossible situation. Marriage to my son is hardly a fate worse than death." "It is if she does not want it," Eryndor said flatly. "And that is the heart of the matter. The debt bondage code treats human beings as commodities, as things to be traded and claimed. It strips them of agency and dignity, and I will not stand by and allow it to continue." Another vampire rose, an older lord named Corvin, who was known for his traditionalist views. "You speak passionately, Lord Xanthos, but passion is not a substitute for law. The debt bondage code has served us well for centuries. It ensures that mortals who deal with us understand the weight of their agreements. If we abolish it, what message does that send? That our contracts mean nothing, that mortals can borrow from us and simply walk away when the terms become inconvenient." "I am not suggesting we allow mortals to renege on their debts," Eryndor said. "I am suggesting that we find more humane ways to enforce those debts, financial penalties, labor contracts with clear terms and protections, mediation through neutral courts. There are a dozen alternatives to forced marriage or indentured servitude. We do not need the debt bondage code to ensure fairness. We only need the will to treat mortals as beings worthy of respect. Seraphine spoke again, her tone measured. Lord Xanthos makes a compelling argument, but I would remind the Council that overturning a code this old requires a 2/3 majority. This is not a decision to be made lightly. I call now for testimony from those directly affected by the code. Hadrian Devereux, you have claimed that Lady Erwood's debt is legitimate and that the marriage settlement was agreed upon. Do you have evidence to support this? Hadrian gestured to his lawyer, who produced a stack of documents. We have the original loan agreement, signed by Lady Erwood's father. We have the terms of repayment, which were clearly stated, and we have a signed agreement from Lady Erwood herself, consenting to the marriage settlement. She signed under duress, Eryndor said sharply. She was threatened with imprisonment if she refused. Debtor's prison is a legal consequence of failing to repay a debt, Hadrian said smoothly. Offering an alternative to that consequence is not duress, it is mercy. The argument went back and forth for hours. Other lords and ladies weighed in, some supporting Eryndor, others defending the Devereux family. The debate grew heated at times, with voices raised and accusations flung. But through it all, Eryndor remained calm and focused, driving home his central argument again and again. The debt bondage code was unjust. It treated mortals as property. It had no place in a modern society that claimed to value fairness and honor. Finally, as the night stretched toward dawn, Seraphine called for a vote. All those in favor of abolishing the debt bondage code, rise and be counted. Eryndor held his breath as the lords and ladies stood one by one. He counted each one, his heart pounding. 32, 33, 34. 2/3 would be 34 votes. They were right on the edge. And then, slowly, a vampire named Isolde, whom Eryndor had always considered neutral, rose from her seat. I vote to abolish, she said clearly. 35. The hall erupted into noise, some cheering, some shouting in protest. Seraphine banged her gavel, calling for order. The motion passes, she declared. The debt bondage code is hereby abolished, effective immediately. All existing claims under the code are nullified. The council is adjourned. Eryndor felt the tension drain out of him all at once, leaving him lightheaded with relief. He had done it. They had done it. Gwendolen was free, and so was anyone else who had been trapped under the code. Hadrian Devereux was on his feet, his face twisted with fury. This is outrageous, he snarled. You have overturned centuries of precedent based on the whims of one lovesick king. This is not justice. This is tyranny. Eryndor met his gaze evenly. Call it what you like, Hadrian. The code is gone, and your claim to Gwendolen Erwood is void. She is free, and you will leave her alone. If you do not, I will bring the full weight of my authority down on your family. Am I clear? Hadrian stared at him for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he turned and stalked out of the hall, his son and lawyer trailing behind him. Eryndor allowed himself a small, private smile. Then he left the hall as well, moving quickly through the corridors back to his private chambers. Gwendolen was waiting for him, pacing nervously by the window. When she saw him, she spun around, her eyes wide with hope and fear. What happened? We won, Eryndor said, and his voice was hoarse with emotion. The code is abolished. You are free, Gwendolen, completely and legally free. She stared at him for a heartbeat, and then she was running across the room, throwing herself into his arms. He caught her, holding her tightly as she sobbed against his chest, her whole body shaking with relief. It is over, he murmured, stroking her hair. You are safe. You never have to fear them again. I cannot believe it, she gasped. I cannot believe you did that. You overturned a law that has stood for centuries, for me. Not just for you, Eryndor said gently, for everyone who has been trapped by it. But yes, you were the catalyst. You were the one who made me see that change was necessary. She pulled back slightly, looking up at him with eyes that were red-rimmed but shining. What happens now? Now you decide what you want, Eryndor said. You are free to go wherever you wish, to build whatever life you choose, or you can stay here with me. The choice is yours." "I want to stay," she said immediately. "I want to be with you, for as long as you will have me." "Forever then," Eryndor said, and he kissed her, pouring everything he felt into that single gesture, relief and love and gratitude and hope. When they broke apart, she said, "I have been thinking about what you said, about turning, about becoming like you." Eryndor's heart skipped a beat. "And? I think I want it," she said slowly. "Not right away. I want some time to be sure, to understand what I am choosing. But eventually, yes. I do not want to lose you. I do not want to spend my life knowing that every year brings me closer to the end while you stay the same. If we are going to be together, I want it to be real. I want it to be forever." "Are you certain?" Eryndor asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Gwendolyn, this is not a decision you can undo. Once you are turned, there is no going back. You will be immortal, but you will also lose your humanity. The sunlight, the warmth, the simple pleasures of mortal life. You will have to drink blood to survive. You will watch everyone you know age and die while you remain unchanged. It is a beautiful life, but it is also a lonely one. It will not be lonely if I have you," she said firmly. "And I would rather face eternity with you than spend a few short decades alone." He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring the feel of her in his arms. "We will take our time," he said. "You will live as immortal for as long as you wish, and when you are ready, truly ready, I will turn you, and we will face eternity together." The weeks that followed were some of the happiest Eryndor had ever known. Gwendolyn stayed at the manor, no longer as a guest but as his partner, his equal. She took an interest in the governance of the territory, sitting in on meetings and offering insights that often surprised him with their clarity. She charmed his court, winning over even the more traditional vampires with her intelligence and grace. She made the manor feel like a home instead of just a seat of power. And at night, when the business of ruling was done, they were simply together. They walked through the gardens and talked about everything. They read to each other in the library, her head resting on his shoulder. They made love slowly and tenderly, learning the map of each other's bodies, finding joy in the simple act of being close. 6 months after the council meeting, on a cool autumn night when the moon was full and bright, Gwendolyn came to him with a quiet certainty in her eyes. "I am ready," she said. Eryndor knew immediately what she meant. He'd been waiting for this moment, dreading it, and longing for it in equal measure. "Are you certain?" he asked, taking her hands in his. "Once we do this, there's no going back." "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," she said. "I love you, Eryndor. I want to spend forever with you. Turn me. Make me yours." He led her to his private chambers, where they would have privacy and quiet. He had prepared everything weeks ago, just in case, gathering the supplies he would need and making sure Ilyana and the other senior staff knew what was happening. Turning immortal was not a simple thing. It required draining them almost to the point of death, then feeding them vampire blood to trigger the transformation. The process was painful and dangerous, and there was always a risk that something could go wrong. But Eryndor had done this before, centuries ago, and he knew how to be careful. He sat Gwendolyn down on the edge of the bed, brushing her hair back from her neck. "This will hurt," he warned her, "but I will be with you the entire time. You will not be alone." "I know," she said, and she tilted her head to the side, offering him her throat. Eryndor bent and kissed the spot where her pulse beat strongest, then let his fangs extend. He bit down gently, feeling the skin give way, and then he began to drink. Her blood was warm and sweet, tasting of life and love and trust. He forced himself to go slowly, taking just enough to weaken her, but not so much that she would slip away before he could complete the transformation. He felt her heartbeat slowing, felt her body going limp in his arms, and only then did he pull back. He bit his own wrist, tearing the skin open and pressed it to her mouth. "Drink," he commanded, and she obeyed, her lips closing around the wound. The transformation began almost immediately. Her body convulsed, her back arching as the vampire blood took hold. Eryndor held her, murmuring reassurances, his hands steady even as his heart raced. This was the dangerous part, the moment when everything could go wrong. But Gwendolyn was strong, and she fought through the pain with a determination that made him proud. It took hours, long, agonizing hours during which she screamed and thrashed and clung to him like a lifeline. But finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the shuttered windows, her body went still. Her breathing stopped, her heart silent, and then, slowly, her eyes opened. They were red now, the same crimson as his own. Her skin had taken on the pale, translucent quality of the very old vampires, and her features seemed sharper, more defined. She was breathtaking. "Eryndor," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I am here," he said, pulling her into his arms. "You did it. You survived. You are one of us now." She clung to him, shaking, and he held her as she adjusted to the new sensations flooding through her, the heightened senses, the unnatural strength, the hunger that gnawed at the edges of her awareness. "I can hear everything," she said wonderingly. "The servants downstairs, the wind in the trees, your heartbeat." She pulled back slightly, looking up at him. "It is so loud, so overwhelming." "It will take time to learn to filter it out," Eryndor said gently. "But you will adjust. I will teach you everything you need to know." Over the following weeks, he did exactly that. He taught her how to control her strength, how to move silently, how to feed without killing. He showed her the hidden world of the vampires, the courts and politics and ancient codes that governed their kind. He introduced her formally to the council, and she was accepted as his consort, the Lady of the Northern Territories. Gwendolen took to immortality with a grace that surprised even Eryndor. She was curious and eager to learn, but she also brought a compassion and humanity to the vampire courts that had been missing for far too long. She worked alongside him to continue reforming the old laws, pushing for changes that would make the relationship between mortals and vampires more equitable. And she loved him with a fierceness that took his breath away, a love that only deepened as the years passed. They were married in a quiet ceremony attended by the inner court, a ritual that bound them not just emotionally, but legally, as partners in rule and in life. Gwendolen wore a gown of midnight blue, and Eryndor thought she had never looked more beautiful. As they stood together before the assembled court, his hand clasped in hers, Eryndor felt a peace settle over him that he had never thought possible. For so long he had been alone, carrying the weight of his crown and his immortality with no one to share the burden. But now he had Gwendolen, his equal, and his love, and the future stretched out before them like a promise. Years passed, decades. The Northern Territories flourished under their joint rule, becoming known for fairness and progress. The abolition of the debt bondage code inspired other reforms, other changes that slowly reshaped the relationship between vampires and mortals. It was not always easy, and there were those who resisted, but Eryndor and Gwendolen faced each challenge together, united in purpose and in love. They traveled the world, visiting other vampire courts and learning from other cultures. They built alliances and forged friendships that would last centuries. And through it all, they remained devoted to each other, their bond only growing stronger with time. One night, nearly 50 years after Gwendolen's turning, they stood together on the balcony of the manor, looking out over the city lights below. The world had changed so much since the night she had collapsed on his steps, and yet some things remained constant. The moon still shone bright above them, the night air still smelled of jasmine, and Eryndor still loved her with the same fierce intensity he had felt that first night. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Giving up your mortality? Choosing this life?" Gwendolen turned to look at him, her red eyes soft in the moonlight. "Never," she said. "Not for a single moment. You gave me freedom, Eryndor. You gave me a voice and a purpose and a love that I never dreamed was possible. How could I regret that?" "I am glad," he said, pulling her close, "because I do not know what I would do without you. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me." "And you are mine," she said, rising on her toes to kiss him. "Forever and always." They stood there together as the night stretched on, two immortals bound by love and choice, facing an eternity that no longer felt like a burden, but a gift. The runaway bride who had shivered on his steps at dawn had become his queen, his partner, his everything. And Eryndor knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that he would love her for all the endless years to come. The future was theirs, bright and unbroken, and they would face it together.